Imagine a child, wild, unfiltered, alive with curiosity. Every corner of their room is a kingdom. Every stick becomes a sword. Every question a portal to infinity. Now picture that same child, months later, seated in a classroom. Their eyes no longer dart with wonder. Instead, they flicker toward the clock on the wall. The stick that once carried the power of myth is replaced by a pencil tracing letters on command. The infinite becomes reduced to the finite. And the tragedy is this: the child does not even know that something sacred has been stolen. This is the first wound inflicted by schooling. It is not physical but spiritual. Schools rarely announce their true mission. It is not to nurture but to normalize, not to cultivate but to contain. From the very beginning, children are taught that the value of their thoughts is measured by compliance with prepackaged answers. Imagination becomes a liability. Silence is rewarded more than originality. The vibrant flame of individuality is gently but persistently smothered under the damp cloth of conformity. The paradox of modern schooling is that it calls itself education, yet it often produces the opposite of what genuine education should be. True education should be the awakening of the soul, the cultivation of independent thought, the sharpening of one's ability to wrestle with uncertainty. But instead, schooling becomes the machinery of domestication, preparing children not for life but for obedience to life's institutions. As Schopenhauer once observed, every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. What else is school but the narrowing of that vision, the shrinking of infinite horizons into testable categories and uniform behaviors? The child who once asked, "Why is the sky blue?" soon learns that the real question is, what does the textbook say about why the sky is blue? The authority of lived wonder is supplanted by the authority of sanctioned knowledge. This substitution appears harmless, even benevolent, but it is the very mechanism by which the young mind learns to distrust itself. To doubt one's own questions, to bury one's own instincts, is the beginning of psychic colonization. Nietzsche warned us of this when he wrote of the herd morality, the system in which individual instincts are tamed for the sake of social harmony. Schools are perhaps the most refined laboratories for this herd morality. They teach us early that approval is conditional, that worth is quantified, that survival depends on fitting in. A child may still feel the subterranean pull of their own creative depths, but each year, that voice becomes fainter, drowned by the chorus of external expectations. Think of the rituals: raising hands to speak, lining up in silence, memorizing dates without context, absorbing formulas without purpose. Each ritual, small in itself, is part of a larger conditioning. The child is taught that life is not to be experienced but managed, not questioned but endured. The real lesson is not the subject matter, it is submission. And this submission is carried forward into adulthood, into workplaces, into politics, into relationships. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." School ensures that most never reach that terror, because they are trained to accept not themselves but the mask demanded by authority. The terror is replaced by comfort, the comfort of grades, approval, predictability. But beneath that comfort lies a deep disquiet, an unnameable ache. The sense that somewhere along the way, one's true life was interrupted. This is the first fracture, the moment when the child begins to mistake obedience for virtue and compliance for intelligence. Yet it is only the beginning, for once the seed of conformity is planted, it grows roots deep into the psyche, roots that will shape how one sees themselves, others, and the very meaning of life itself. And so the question arises: if school begins by silencing the voice of individuality, what becomes of the child's capacity for freedom? The answer lies in the next wound, the systematic assault on creativity and instinct. Close your eyes and imagine a child painting. They don't worry if the colors clash or if the shapes make sense. The canvas becomes an explosion of raw instinct. Reds colliding with blues, jagged lines breaking into spirals, forms born not from instruction but from impulse. Now imagine that same child 3 years into school. Their art is suddenly graded. Stay inside the lines. The sky must be blue. Trees are green, not purple. The boundless landscape of imagination shrinks into a coloring book. And in that moment, a silent execution takes place, the execution of instinct. Creativity is dangerous to institutions, for it resists predictability. Schools are designed to domesticate, not to liberate. They do not want the child who draws a purple sky, because a purple sky is useless to the machinery of efficiency. They want children who can replicate, not invent, who can consume, not create. Thus begins the second wound, the systematic murder of creativity and instinct, the very qualities that make us human. Friedrich Nietzsche declared, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." Yet from the first years of schooling, chaos is treated as error, as something to be corrected rather than cultivated. The very energy that could erupt into genius is labeled as misbehavior. The child who refuses to sit still is not seen as a force of life but as a problem to be managed. And so, instinct is trimmed down, reshaped, caged until it fits the mold. Consider how subjects are taught. Art, when allowed at all, is restricted to reproducing accepted patterns. Music is reduced to scales and notation. Writing becomes formulaic, strangled by rubrics. Even play, that sacred realm of instinct, is increasingly policed, structured into productive activities or eliminated in favor of test preparation. The message is clear. What is spontaneous must be tamed. What is intuitive must be corrected. The body and mind are to be trained not to express themselves but to obey. This conditioning does not merely silence creativity. It replaces it with imitation. Students learn to mimic the thoughts of others, to echo the voices of authority. Their imagination is trained not toward creation but toward prediction. What does the teacher want me to write? What answer will get me the grade? What formula will get me through the exam? In this way, instinct is not only suppressed but inverted. It no longer points inward, toward the depths of the self, but outward, toward the expectations of the system. The cost of this inversion is profound. When instinct is severed, the individual loses touch with their own vitality. They begin to live as if they are strangers within their own skin, always seeking external validation, always fearing deviation. The dancing star that Nietzsche spoke of is suffocated long before it has the chance to shine. What remains is a hollow echo of what could have been. Aldous Huxley once warned, "Children are not machines, and yet schools are organized as if they were. Machines have no instincts, no unpredictable desires, no surges of creativity. They function, they perform, they conform. And so, children are taught to approximate machines, to suppress the chaos of their nature in order to run smoothly within the system. But the tragedy is that the very thing that makes life worth living, the fire of creation, the spontaneity of instinct, is discarded as waste. The second wound deepens the fracture opened by the first. The child has already been taught that obedience is survival. Now they are taught that creativity is dangerous, instinct unreliable. With these lessons internalized, the stage is set for the third and perhaps most insidious wound, the slow erosion of authentic thought, where one no longer merely suppresses instinct but learns to distrust one's own capacity to think altogether. There comes a moment in every student's life when they realize the unspoken rule. Thinking for yourself is not what is rewarded. What is rewarded is thinking correctly, meaning thinking in alignment with authority. At first, this distinction is subtle. A child may answer a question with their own interpretation, only to be told it is wrong. Soon they discover the safer route. Repeat what the textbook says, echo what the teacher desires, and you will be praised. Independent thought is not forbidden outright, but it is quietly penalized until the child learns to abandon it on their own. This is the third wound, the slow, invisible erosion of authentic thought. Unlike the first two wounds, which target individuality and creativity, this one goes deeper. It strikes at the very core of what it means to be a conscious being. The capacity to think, to question, to wrestle with truth on one's own terms. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "To think for yourself, you must think against yourself." True thinking is not comfortable. It demands that one wrestle with paradox, uncertainty, and even pain. But the schooling system does not train children to endure such discomfort. Instead, it offers the narcotic of certainty. For every question, there is a prepackaged answer. For every problem, a formula. For every essay, a rubric. The child learns that the world is not a vast wilderness to be explored but a map already drawn, with every path predetermined. The cost of this training is devastating. When the mind is deprived of the struggle of authentic thought, it atrophies. Students become adept at remembering, repeating, and regurgitating, but they lose the capacity for genuine reflection. They know what to think but not how to think. They can perform brilliantly on standardized tests yet falter when confronted with the raw ambiguity of life. Jean-Paul Sartre warned us of this danger when he declared, "Man is condemned to be free. To live authentically means embracing the burden of choice, of thinking without guarantees, of facing a world that does not hand us ready-made meanings." Schooling, however, trains us to flee from this burden. It seduces us into preferring the safety of ready-made answers over the terror of freedom. In this way, education becomes not liberation but escape, a retreat into conformity, where the individual is shielded from the necessity of confronting their own freedom. The rituals of school reinforce this lesson daily. Consider the classroom discussion. A question is asked, students raise their hands, one is called upon, and the teacher evaluates the answer. The student learns not that truth is a living dialogue, but that truth is a commodity controlled by authority. Or think of the essay assignment. Instead of encouraging exploration, the rubric dictates structure, word count, and criteria. The student learns not to search for what they truly think, but to guess what the evaluator wants to see. Over time, this habituation corrodes the very desire to think for oneself. By adulthood, the damage is evident. Many people feel uncomfortable in silence, unable to generate thoughts that are not echoes of media, institutions, or authority figures. The authentic voice within, the one that could challenge, disrupt, or create, is drowned out by internalized scripts. They are no longer even aware of the loss, for they believe the borrowed thoughts are their own. Viktor Frankl, reflecting on the human condition, once wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. But schooling trains us to collapse that space, to replace it with reflexive obedience. The moment for authentic thought is bypassed. Instead, we respond not with freedom but with conditioned reaction. The erosion of thought is the erosion of freedom itself. And once the individual has surrendered their capacity for authentic thinking, the fourth wound follows naturally. The internalization of authority, where the external voice of the teacher becomes the inner voice of conscience, and the chains of obedience no longer need to be imposed, they are self-inflicted. Imagine a classroom where the teacher does not even need to speak. The students sit upright, silent, their eyes fixed on their work. They obey not because of immediate threats or punishments, but because the command has already been implanted within them. This is the hidden triumph of schooling, not just external obedience, but the internalization of authority. The system succeeds most fully when the child begins to police themselves, when the chains no longer come from outside but from within. The fourth wound is the most insidious of all, the colonization of the inner life. By the time a child has endured years of school, they no longer need constant correction. They have absorbed the corrective voice into their own psyche. They hesitate before speaking their mind, they censor their impulses, they second-guess their originality, all without anyone telling them to. Authority has been internalized, and the prison now resides in the mind itself. This transformation is subtle but devastating. At first, the student fears punishment from teachers or ridicule from peers, but gradually those fears calcify into habits of thought. Better not say that, it might be wrong. Don't draw that, it looks strange. Don't ask that question, it sounds foolish. What began as external discipline becomes self-discipline, and what was once imposed becomes voluntary. The individual no longer needs the ruler or the red pen. They carry the judgment within themselves. Carl Jung described this phenomenon with chilling accuracy. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. In school, this burden multiplies. The unlived expectations of parents, teachers, and institutions all converge on the child, until their inner world becomes colonized by voices that are not their own. The authentic self is buried beneath layers of internalized authority, leaving behind a compliant echo. The effects of this wound extend far beyond childhood. Adults who have internalized authority often struggle with decision-making. They second-guess their instincts, paralyzed by the fear of being wrong. They crave approval, unable to act without external validation. Even in solitude, they feel watched, not by others, but by the internalized overseer that school carefully cultivated. This is why so many people live lives of quiet conformity, never daring to deviate from the script. The system no longer needs to enforce control, because the control has been etched into their very consciousness. Consider how schooling conditions this. The constant grading system trains children to equate self-worth with external evaluation. Over time, they no longer ask themselves, do I understand this? Do I believe this? Instead, they ask, will this get me an A? Will this earn approval? The metric becomes internalized, and the authentic measure of truth is lost. In adulthood, the grades are replaced by salaries, promotions, or social approval, but the mechanism is the same. The authority may shift, but the internal submission remains. Nietzsche once wrote, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." This corruption is the very essence of schooling. To convince the young that sameness is safety, that difference is danger. And once this conviction is internalized, authority no longer needs to coerce, it merely whispers and the individual obeys. This fourth wound, the colonization of the inner voice, ensures that rebellion is stifled before it even begins. What need is there for external chains when the prisoner has learned to guard their own cell? Yet this very process sets the stage for an even deeper devastation, the estrangement from meaning itself. For when the authentic voice is silenced and authority is internalized, one is left to wander in a world where existence feels hollow, directionless, and absurd. This is the fifth wound, the crisis of meaning that shadows us from adolescence into adulthood. There is a peculiar moment that many people recall from adolescence. You are sitting in class, staring at a formula on the board, memorizing dates for an exam, or reading passages from a textbook you care nothing about. And suddenly, a quiet but dangerous question rises inside you. What is the point of this? The room continues as if nothing has changed. Your classmates scribbling notes, the teacher explaining, but you are elsewhere, suspended in a void of meaninglessness. This is not laziness, as adults often claim. It is the whisper of the soul, asking the one question school cannot answer. Why? The fifth wound inflicted by schooling is the erosion of meaning. It is not merely that subjects feel irrelevant. It is that the very structure of education divorces knowledge from life. Instead of being initiated into the mysteries of existence, children are drilled in abstractions detached from their own experience. Math is reduced to symbols without context. History becomes a litany of dates devoid of human struggle. Literature is dissected not for insight but for grades. The sacred hunger for meaning is starved by a diet of sterile information. Viktor Frankl, who endured the unimaginable horrors of concentration camps, taught that those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. Yet schools rarely offer a why. They bombard children with endless hows, how to solve, how to answer, how to comply, without connecting these to any deeper purpose. As a result, students learn facts without significance, skills without soul, disciplines without destiny. They graduate fluent in formulas but estranged from themselves. The crisis of meaning manifests in two ways. For some, it produces apathy. They move through school in a fog, doing the bare minimum, disengaged, waiting for life to begin somewhere else. For others, it produces anxiety. They strive for perfection, not out of love for learning, but out of terror that without good grades, their future will collapse. In both cases, the root wound is the same. A life stripped of intrinsic meaning, where value is measured only by external benchmarks. Aldous Huxley once lamented, "Most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted." School cultivates this habit by presenting meaning as something external, predetermined, unquestionable. You are not invited to ask why knowledge matters. You are told that it does, and your role is to accept. Over time, This passive acceptance seeps into the very fabric of existence. One learns to drift through life, chasing achievements, careers, possessions, never pausing to ask the dangerous question, what is the point of all this? But that question never truly disappears. It festers in the unconscious, emerging in moments of crisis, depression, or disillusionment. Many adults look back and realize that they were never taught how to wrestle with meaning itself. They were prepared for jobs, not for existence. They know how to calculate interest rates, but not how to confront mortality. They know how to write essays, but not how to write their own lives. The tragedy is that children are born with a natural sense of wonder. A 5-year-old does not need to be taught to ask about life, death, love, or time. These questions erupt spontaneously from their being. But by the time they leave school, most have lost this hunger. Their questions have been replaced by answers they never chose. Their sense of wonder has been anesthetized by routine. And so, when the crises of adulthood arrive, they find themselves defenseless, grasping for meaning in a world that feels indifferent. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this existential vacuum with haunting precision. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself, yet schooling deprives us of the tools to make ourselves. It trains us to inherit scripts, not to write them. And when the borrowed scripts collapse, as they inevitably do, the result is despair. The fifth wound is the wound of emptiness, the silent conviction that life is just a series of obligations without a center, without a flame. But this emptiness is not the final blow. The last and most devastating wound emerges when the soul, having been stripped of individuality, creativity, thought, authority, and meaning, resigns itself to mediocrity, to living not as a free being but as a cog in the machine. This is the sixth wound, the death of the will to transcend. Picture a young adult standing on the threshold of the world. They have graduated, diploma in hand, the supposed symbol of readiness. Yet beneath the surface, something is missing. They feel uncertain, restless, vaguely hollow. They know how to follow rules, complete assignments, climb ladders, but when confronted with the vastness of existence, they falter. The machinery of schooling has prepared them to function, but not to live. What has quietly died within them is the will to transcend, to rise beyond survival, beyond conformity, beyond mediocrity. This is the final wound, the quiet assassination of transcendence. It is the moment when the individual ceases to believe in their own potential for greatness, for depth, for becoming more than what the system has carved out for them. Instead, they settle. They accept a life of repetition, of work for work's sake, of pleasures that distract but do not fulfill. The spark of transcendence, the hunger to break boundaries, to create, to wrestle with the abyss, is smothered by the dust of routine. Nietzsche warned of this fate in his vision of the last man, the creature who desires only comfort, safety, and predictability. The last man asks no great questions, pursues no great projects, risks nothing. He is content with entertainment, with consumption, with distraction. And schooling, by design, mass-produces last men. It trains the young not to aspire to the extraordinary, but to settle into the ordinary, to adjust themselves to the machinery of society. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. But by the time one emerges from years of schooling, the eyes of genius have been clouded. The unseen targets, the transcendent possibilities of life, are invisible not because they do not exist, but because the individual has been trained not to look for them. To dream beyond the accepted boundaries feels dangerous, even foolish, and so most never try. The death of transcendence is not dramatic. It does not arrive with a sudden collapse, but with a slow surrender. It is the young artist who stops painting because there is no grade for it. The philosopher who stops asking questions because they don't appear on the test. The dreamer who trades their vision for security because risk feels unbearable. Over time, these surrenders accumulate until the soul itself feels smaller, dimmer, quieter. And yet, a paradox lingers here. For even when transcendence is buried, its ghost haunts us. In sleepless nights, in moments of despair, in flashes of longing, something in us whispers that we were meant for more. that we were not born merely to obey, to conform, to survive, but to create, to question, to love, to confront the vastness of being. This haunting is both a curse and a gift. For though school may wound the will to transcend, it cannot annihilate it completely. The possibility remains dormant but not extinguished. Carl Jung spoke to this possibility when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Schools may obscure this privilege, bury it under conformity and fear, but they cannot erase it. To awaken to this truth requires rebellion, not the shallow rebellion of defiance for its own sake, but the deeper rebellion of reclaiming one's own soul from the machinery of indoctrination. The sixth wound, then, is not the end but the beginning of a choice. One can remain bound, living as a cog, a last man, a creature of habit and fear, or one can dare to resurrect transcendence, to risk failure, to embrace the terror of authentic freedom. The wounds of school are real and they run deep, but they also point toward the possibility of healing, for to recognize the chains is already to begin loosening them. And so, the final question is not whether school destroys the mind, it does. The question is whether, knowing this, we dare to rebuild ourselves, to become more than the obedient products of an institution, to reclaim the transcendence that is our birthright. For only then does education, true education, begin.